The hum of the engines lulled the passengers into a false sense of calm. It was a routine flight, just another red-eye cruising through clear skies. In row 10, a woman sat slumped against the window, hoodie pulled over her head, breathing steady in sleep. No one gave her a second glance. She looked like just another traveler escaping the monotony of airports. But then, turbulence shook the cabin. The overhead lights flickered. Murmurs rippled down the aisle as the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a critical systems failure. If there is a licensed combat pilot on board, please make yourself known." Gasps. Panic. Heads turned in disbelief. A combat pilot. On a passenger plane, the woman in row 10 stirred, rubbed her eyes, and sat upright. For a moment she hesitated. Passengers whispered, some scoffing, others terrified. And then she quietly rose, tugging her hoodie down just enough to reveal a patch tattooed into her arm. Those who recognized it froze. She wasn't just any pilot. She was the pilot, the kind who'd flown missions through fire, storms, and enemy fire. The cabin held its breath. The woman from row 10 was no longer invisible. The terminal was loud with rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and the drone of tired travelers shuffling toward their gates. For most, this flight was just a necessary connection, a way to get from point A to point B before the grind of work resumed the next day. Nobody paid much attention to one another, except for the occasional polite smile or annoyed glance when someone blocked the aisle too long. By the time boarding closed, Flight 247 looked like any other red-eye. Businessmen loosened their ties, scrolling through endless emails. Families tried to settle restless children with snacks and cartoons on tablets. A group of college students laughed too loudly in the back rows, already treating the trip as an adventure. And in row 10, tucked against the window, sat a woman who seemed invisible to everyone around her. She wore an oversized gray hoodie, the hood pulled low over her face, and a pair of worn-out sneakers that had seen better days. No designer luggage, no chatter, no effort to blend in or stand out. She carried herself with the kind of quietness that comes only from habit, like someone who had spent years fading into the background. To most, she looked like just another weary traveler catching up on sleep. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the small details that didn't quite fit. The way her back stayed perfectly straight, even as she leaned against the seat. The faint outline of calloused hands resting loosely in her lap. The subtle scanning of the cabin when she first boarded, as though she was unconsciously mapping exits, measuring distances, cataloging faces. These were habits forged far from airports and layovers, habits that belonged to someone who had lived through storms most civilians couldn't imagine. She closed her eyes, sinking into half-sleep as the plane lifted off. The steady hum of the engines became a lullaby, masking the tension that never fully left her body. Around her, passengers flipped magazines, sipped coffee, and adjusted headphones. Conversations rose and fell, laughter spilling across the aisles. For a while, the cabin was nothing but ordinary. A flight attendant passed by, pausing briefly at row 10. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked softly. The woman shook her head without opening her eyes. Her voice was calm, almost distant. "No, thank you." The attendant moved on, forgetting her instantly. Everyone did. She wanted it that way. In the row ahead, a businessman muttered into his phone, irritated that the Wi-Fi wasn't strong enough for video calls. In the row behind, a child asked his mother for the third time if they were almost there. The aircraft settled into routine cruising altitude, and time stretched in that peculiar way it always does in the air, both fast and unbearably slow. To anyone watching, this was a flight like countless others, uneventful, forgettable, destined to blur into the background of memory. No one knew that within the next hour this cabin would transform into something else entirely. No one knew that the quiet woman in row 10 was about to become the only line between safety and disaster. For now, she slept, and the plane moved forward, unaware of the storm waiting in its path. It started with a sound no passenger ever wants to hear on a flight. A sharp ping followed by the captain's voice, lower than usual, carefully measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and stay seated with your seatbelts fastened." The tone wasn't casual. It wasn't the rehearsed calm used during turbulence announcements. It was clipped, almost brittle, the kind of tone that suggested something far more serious than a little bump in the air. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The businessman in front of row 10 pulled his tie tighter, his jaw stiffening. The mother in row 11 clutched her child closer. The laughter from the college students faded into silence. Then it happened. The shudder. The whole aircraft jolted violently, luggage rattling in the overhead bins. Someone screamed. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked with a sharp ding-ding. A flight attendant gripped the overhead compartment for balance, her knuckles pale as she forced a smile. The woman in row 10 opened her eyes instantly. Not in panic. Her expression was cool, focused. She listened carefully. The hum of the engine sounded uneven. The vibrations weren't normal. And beneath the captain's polished announcement, she had caught something else, a slight tremor in his voice. The captain's voice returned, this time tighter. "We have lost primary navigation systems due to severe electrical interference. We are attempting to stabilize. I repeat, remain calm." But the passengers weren't calm. Panic spread like fire in dry grass. A child cried. The businessman cursed loudly, demanding answers. People whispered, their voices sharp with fear. The woman in row 10 sat perfectly still, her mind working faster than the chaos around her. She knew interference didn't come from nowhere. It had a source, and in her experience, technical difficulties were rarely just mechanical failures. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her voice hushed but urgent as she leaned toward a colleague. "The captain says we've lost one engine. He's trying to reroute power, but—" The rest of her words were swallowed by another violent jolt. Oxygen masks rattled, dangling from the ceiling like ghostly warnings. Gasps filled the cabin. That was when the captain made the call no one expected. His voice boomed through the intercom. "Is there anyone on board with combat aviation experience? Repeat, anyone with military or combat flight training, please identify yourself immediately." The words hung in the air, heavy with disbelief. Passengers froze. A businessman muttered, "This can't be real." A woman clutched her cross necklace, and in row 10, the quiet woman slowly opened her eyes, pulling back her hood. The scars on her jawline caught the dim cabin light, faint but undeniable, the kind of scars left not by accidents but by battle. She didn't move at first. For years, she had avoided the spotlight, burying the part of her life that once defined her. But now, 30,000 feet above the ground, with 200 lives in jeopardy, silence was no longer an option. The flight attendant rushed past her, calling out, "Anyone? Please, if you can help." The woman stood. Not dramatically, not with a speech. Just a simple, steady rise from her seat. Conversations cut off. Heads turned. Every pair of eyes in the cabin seemed to lock on her at once. She spoke only 2 words, her voice calm but commanding. "I can." For a moment, the cabin seemed frozen in disbelief. Then whispers erupted, half relief, half doubt. "Her? She's so young. She doesn't look like a pilot. Is this some kind of joke?" But when she stepped into the aisle, her presence silenced the noise. There was no hesitation in her stride, no wavering in her eyes. She moved like someone who had walked through chaos before and survived. The captain's voice returned, urgent but steady. "Whoever you are, get to the cockpit. We need you." And just like that, the ordinary woman from row 10 was no longer invisible. She was walking toward the front of the aircraft, past rows of passengers who could only stare. None of them knew her story. None of them knew the name once whispered with reverence in military hangars across the globe. But they were about to. The cockpit door opened with a metallic click, and the quiet woman from row 10 stepped through. The air inside was different. Thicker, tense, electric with urgency. Warning alarms pulsed across the control panels, red and amber lights flashing like beacons of doom. The captain, a seasoned man with graying temples, turned, sweat beading his forehead. Beside him, the first officer's hands trembled slightly over the controls, his voice sharp with panic. "You said you've flown before?" the captain asked quickly, his tone caught between skepticism and desperation. The woman gave a short nod. "Combat aircraft." "Multiple tours," the first officer scoffed. "This isn't the same as pulling stunts in a fighter jet. This is a fully loaded passenger plane. It's completely different." Her gaze flicked to the panels, reading the chaos like a second language. "You've lost one engine. The other's straining. Navigation's shot. You're running on backup power and partial hydraulics." She looked back at the captain, her eyes steady. "How long before we lose altitude?" The captain blinked. 5 minutes, maybe less, she stepped. The storm outside raged with a violence few had ever seen. Sheets of rain hammered the aircraft, lightning slashed across the night sky, and turbulence jolted the fuselage so hard that passengers screamed with every drop. Inside the cockpit, the air felt just as suffocating. Warning chimes wouldn't stop. Screens flickered with red errors. The first officer's hands hovered uncertainly above the yoke, his breath ragged, eyes darting between failing gauges. The woman slid into the co-pilot's seat like she'd done it 1,000 times. No wasted movements. No hesitation. She strapped herself in, fingers moving across the controls with swift familiarity. "You've flown combat aircraft." "You said," the captain muttered, gripping the yoke. "Not just flown them," she replied calmly. "I've landed a crippled jet in blackout conditions while being fired at. Trust me, this storm isn't the worst thing I've seen." Her tone carried a steel edge that silenced the first officer's protests. For the first time, the captain allowed himself a flicker of hope. The plane shook violently, sending overhead bins rattling open in the cabin. Luggage crashed into the aisles. A baby's cry pierced the chaos. Passengers clutched their armrests, whispering prayers, while the flight attendants did their best to keep order. No one knew that, in the cockpit, their fates hung by a thread and a stranger's hands. The instruments glitched again. Navigation failed completely. "They were flying blind. Switch to manual," she ordered. The captain frowned. "In this storm? That's suicide. Not if you trust me." Her voice was steady, her eyes locked on his. "I've flown blind before. Sometimes instinct is stronger than any instrument." The captain hesitated, then slowly nodded. He disengaged the autopilot. The yoke lurched violently, the aircraft fighting back like a beast unwilling to be tamed. She grabbed the controls. Her hands, scarred, strong, practiced, moved with controlled precision. Every jolt, every drop, every roll of the storm became a conversation between her and the machine. "Level her out," she murmured, coaxing the aircraft with steady pressure. "Don't fight the storm, flow with it. Let it push, then guide her back." The captain watched, stunned. The woman wasn't just piloting. She was dancing with the storm. Minutes dragged like hours. Sweat trickled down the captain's face. The first officer sat frozen, wide-eyed as if witnessing something beyond belief. Finally, through the cockpit window, the black wall of storm began to break. A patch of moonlight spilled across the clouds. The turbulence eased just slightly. The passengers in the cabin gasped in relief when the violent shaking subsided. Someone whispered, "We're still alive." But inside the cockpit, the danger was far from over. The remaining engine was straining, threatening to give out. They were still far from any airport, flying on sheer willpower and the skill of the woman from row 10. She tightened her grip on the yoke, her jaw set. "We're not safe yet, but we will be." The captain exchanged a glance with her and realized something. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This woman had carried lives in her hands before and saved them. And now, she was doing it again. The storm had loosened its grip, but danger still coiled around the aircraft like a predator waiting for the kill. The radar was gone, navigation dead, one engine barely hanging on. They were flying through the night with no clear path forward. Inside the cabin, passengers whispered prayers, tears streaking faces. Children clung to parents. Attendants tried to keep order, but every eye was locked on the overhead lights that flickered with every surge of turbulence. Somewhere back in row 10, her abandoned seatbelt dangled loose, a reminder that the quiet stranger was now the one keeping them alive. In the cockpit, tension pulsed thick as smoke. The captain's hands trembled on the console. The first officer sat pale, mumbling checklists he could no longer follow without functioning instruments. But the woman, calm, deliberate, moved like this was muscle memory. "We need a place to put her down," she said firmly, scanning the black void ahead. "There's nothing within range," the captain muttered. "The nearest airport's too far. With one engine, we won't make it. Then we improvise." Her tone carried no hesitation. "I've landed in worse places than runways." The captain shot her a look. She wasn't joking. Her scarred hands gripped the controls with the confidence of someone who had brought metal birds home from the jaws of hell. Minutes ticked by like hours. Then, through a break in the clouds, she spotted something glinting in the moonlight. A stretch of straight, flat land. A deserted highway. "There." She pointed. "That's our." The silver ribbon of highway stretched through the darkness, faint headlights of distant cars crawling along its edges. To most, it was nothing more than an empty road, but to her, it was salvation. "That's insane," the first officer blurted. "Highways aren't built for planes." "They weren't built for war zones either," she shot back, eyes locked on the target. "And I've landed on worse." The captain swallowed hard, staring at the flickering instruments, then at her steady hands. He realized something crucial. She wasn't suggesting. She was deciding. "All right," he said hoarsely. "Let's do it." The passengers felt the shift long before they knew what was happening. The engines roared, the plane dipped lower, and whispers spread. "Are we landing? Where? There's no runway." Mothers clutched children tighter, hands folded in desperate prayer. The cockpit became a crucible of tension. Alarms wailed, warning lights flashed, but she silenced them with a flick. Her focus narrowed to the moonlit strip of asphalt rushing closer. "Flaps down," she ordered. The first officer obeyed, hands trembling as he extended the flaps. The plane shuddered violently, fighting the sudden drag. She gritted her teeth, easing the nose down. Steady, steady. Outside, the storm still spat rain and gusts, tossing the aircraft like a toy. The landing gear groaned as it extended, gears scraping against crosswinds. For a moment, it seemed the wheels might never lock. Then, clunk. "Locked in place! Brace!" The captain barked into the intercom. In the cabin, passengers bent forward, clutching seats, but the aircraft descended like a wounded bird, fighting both gravity and the storm's furious crosswinds. The highway below gleamed slick with rain, headlights of startled drivers swerving to the shoulders as the roaring shadow of the jet engulfed the night. "Too fast," the first officer muttered, panic rising. "We're coming in too fast. Not if I bleed her speed now," she cut him off, pulling back on the yoke with surgical precision. Her jaw tightened, every muscle tuned to the delicate balance between lift and stall. The APU hummed faintly, straining to keep the systems alive. The plane dipped lower. 500 feet. 400. The windshield wipers struggled against sheets of rain, smearing streaks across the glass. To the passengers, the outside world was just a blur of lights and blackness. To her, it was a canvas she had read before, in places far deadlier than this. "Gear down," she commanded again, though they were already locked. More for rhythm, for control, for focus. The captain's knuckles whitened on the console. God help us! At 200 feet, a sudden gust slammed into the fuselage, pitching the aircraft sideways. Gasps erupted in the cabin as the world tilted violently. Luggage crashed from overhead bins. A scream tore through the silence. But she didn't flinch. Her scarred hands moved with inhuman calm, countering the roll, leveling the wings. "Not today," she whispered under her breath. The wheels touched, hard. The first bounce rattled teeth, the second nearly careened them off the asphalt. But she held firm, pulling the nose up, forcing the jet to settle. Thud. The landing gear screeched, rubber burning against wet pavement. Sparks flew, smoke trailed, but the aircraft clung to the highway. "Reverse thrust," she barked. The captain slammed the controls. Engines howled. The plane shuddered violently as it decelerated. Cars screeched to a halt, headlights illuminating the impossible sight of a passenger jet barreling down their road. Inside the cabin, passengers clutched one another, tears streaming as they realized they weren't crashing. They were landing. Half a mile, a quarter mile. The brakes groaned. The smell of scorched rubber filled the cabin. The end of the highway loomed, a guardrail, black trees beyond. "Come on," she hissed, pressing every ounce of willpower into the controls. Finally, mercifully, the jet shuddered to a grinding stop, less than 100 yards from the guardrail. Silence. For a moment, the only sound was the hiss of rain and the ticking of cooling metal. No alarms, no screaming, just the stunned stillness of survival. Then, as if on cue, the cabin erupted. Cheers, sobs, hands clapping, strangers embracing. People who moments earlier thought their lives were over now wept with joy. The captain turned slowly to the woman in the co-pilot's seat. His chest heaved, his voice broken. "Who are you?" She unstrapped, her expression unreadable. Someone who doesn't like unfinished flights. And just like that, she stood, walked back into the cabin and blended again with the crowd, row 10 reclaiming its passenger.